Tanks, DPS and support, the holy trinity of classes in video games, the standard for how roles in video games are split. But how are they actually split? Or better question, how should they be split? In my last video I talked a lot about tanks in Overwatch and how they were designed, essentially talking about which roles they filled. In there I also talked about which role they should fill, but I did forget about one important factor in that conversation, that being how the other classes are designed. So this time let's talk about what roles all of the classes can fill, how they can be combined and how they should be combined. Starting off with the tanks. The main role of the tanks is usually to take damage for their team, but the way they do it can vary a lot. The two most popular ways are barriers and shields, which will take the damage for your team, and just straight up bullets punching, the latter of which also has multiple ways to be done. First up there are taunts, which will pull enemy aggro automatically towards the tank, and secondly, the tank can be designed in a way where you're always the closest to the enemies and with that always the one getting aggro. In other words, there's an active and a passive way to bullets punch. This creates the opportunity for characters who aren't designed to be tanks to end up as tanks. This is mainly a problem in games like League of Legends, where the base stats of the character themselves aren't going to be the hindering factor in the roles you are going to fill, as there are many ways to increase them throughout the game. This means that while in games like Overwatch, someone like Genji will never be able to be a tank, in games like League, a character that was designed to be a bruiser might just end up as a tank. But tanking alone often isn't enough to make a good tank, as there is a very important second role they often fill as a disruptor. To fill this role they often have CC in their kit, which are effects like stunts, slows or even taunts. With these effects they make it hard for the enemy team to do their jobs, while making it possible for your team to do theirs. They are usually given to tanks to make them threatening to the enemy team without turning them into an oversized DPS. This is also how passive bullets punching works, as the enemy team can't just ignore you and has to get rid of you so they can defend themselves against your team. With the tank covered, let's go to the second class, the DPS. DPS often have one and only one role they fill, dealing damage. Or to be more precise, killing the enemy. But at least there are many ways they can do that. For example, the damage they deal can be very front-loaded, bursty, or very back-loaded, sustained. And even though that doesn't change their role in general, it changes which targets they will focus. For example, very burst heavy characters will focus more squishy characters like other DPS and supports, as they usually lack the defensive capabilities to survive attacks from them, and the DPS themselves lacks the damage to deal with tanks. Meanwhile, the sustained DPS has a very high damage output over a long time, making them great for dealing with tanks, while also making them capable of dealing with other DPS and supports. In exchange, you are very weak to more bursty DPS, as even though they have less damage than you, it's still enough to kill you. With this difference, it's possible to create two very different playstyles for DPS. But with both being damage, it does seem kinda samey, doesn't it? So let's give them another role they can fill. That being debuffs. Dealing damage is not the only way to, well, deal damage. For example, if you inflict an enemy with a 10% damage vulnerability and he takes 200 damage, you indirectly dealt 20 damage. But you might ask yourself why use debuffs and not buffs. The reason why I'm staying with debuffs instead of buffs is because I wanna keep the offensive nature of the DPS class. And damage vulnerability isn't the only way to indirectly deal damage to the enemy. There are also many other effects, for example anti-heal, which even though it doesn't deal damage, it negates all of the healing the enemy does. The reason why I think DPS should have debuffs is that it makes the game more dynamic and makes DPS less egocentric and more team focused. The reason for the former of which is that it gives every character more identity and more niches where they can be used, instead of making them more generalized. I also think we shouldn't be stopping at debuffs, but also add a role from the tanks, disruption. I know that this overlaps with the tank role, but once we get to the supports you will see that overlap in the roles they can fill is nearly unavoidable. That's why it's so important to pick the right roles they do fill for your game. Still, for DPS it does make a difference, as here you don't just use it for disruption, you use it to create opportunities to deal more damage. Additionally, on DPS it should be more selfish and less team centric, meaning that the effects should mainly be applied on single targets instead of the entire enemy team. This makes it that the DPS utility doesn't make tanks abundant or the other way around, and keeps it from being so OP that you have to nerf the damage into the ground. With two of the three classes covered, let's move on to the last one, the support. Supports have the biggest variation in terms of roles they fill, ranging from heals to debuffing enemies. The only thing that usually isn't on that list is dealing damage. And since supports have so many things they can do, there has bound to be at least one thing that's unique to them, that being buffing the team. Be it by increasing movement speed, attack speed or damage, many supports usually have one buff in their kit, that one being usually offensive and rarely being a defensive one. But that's already it for unique roles for supports, as the next one already is very similar to the main tank role, sustaining the team. The main difference here between the tanks and the support's role is that the tank tries to protect the team from the team, making it that they don't take the damage, while the support tries to mitigate the damage they do take. That can be seen in the kind of defensive utility they have, as where tanks usually have things like barriers that block attacks, supports usually have things like shields and heals that allow the units to take the damage. But supports don't exclusively have defensive utility, many of them also have offensive utility, the majority of which are debuffs. While this is very similar to how the debuffs work for DPS, there is a very important distinction. The debuffs on supports are mainly to enhance their teammates' capabilities and not to enhance their own. That means that they are either more severe, having stronger effects, or target multiple enemies at a time and not just single ones. Additionally, they aren't limited to offensive debuffs and can often also be defensive, like for example debuffs that decrease the opponent's damage output. But debuffs aren't the only enemy focused utility supports can have. There's also another one, disruption. But just like the protection of the team, this one varies a lot in the details from the tank's disruption. For example, support's disruption is very more defensive focused and not as generally or offensively useful as tank's disruption. Like I said at the beginning of this section, supports have many roles, but I think it's actually possible to sum them up in one word: utility. The support's role is not to do anything by himself, but to enhance what the team can do, focusing on helping their plays instead of focusing on making plays on their own. This makes them very dangerous for game design, as you have the opportunity to focus on the same role as another class. In such a scenario, it might happen that the two roles enhance each other, causing the entire game to be centered around those parts of the class identities. But how do we have to design class identities to not run into these problems? Well, let's take a look first at how they are usually designed. Starting with the classic frontline, damage dealer and healer split. This split includes the three most stereotypical archetypes of the three classes, with the tank being a bullet sponge that deals little to no damage, the DPS being a pure glass cannon, and the support allowing the tank to take damage while also correcting mistakes the DPS might make. But depending on the situation this split is used, the exact roles of the support may vary, focusing more or sometimes even entirely on buffing their allies. This split is usually used for PvE games, for the players and often also for the enemies, and games where everybody controls multiple characters. This is because here every class relies on every other class, which often creates frustration in PvP games, as one incompetent ally can ruin the game for the whole team. While in PvE games, this often can be balanced out on lower difficulties, and on higher difficulties everybody knows what he's doing and bad teammates are much less common. In PvP games, on the other hand, it's much more common for every class to have some level of damage, allowing the team to somewhat function even with a bad DPS. This shift usually was also followed with the shift to a more offensive tank that focused more on disruption and less on protecting their team. This is because tanks and supports now rely less on their DPS, while if they kept the same defensive utility, they would still scale off each other the same way, making it possible for them to not use a DPS and focus more on the synergy between them. With two great examples of this being Goats and Double Shields meta from Overwatch, with both metas essentially revolving around the defensive utility the tanks and supports provided. And that's even though both of the metas weren't entirely without DPSs. But that's mainly because in Overwatch many of the DPSs also have a high amount of utility, like stuns, slows or displacements. Still, both metas were dominated by the defensive capabilities of their respective comps, using the most defensive tanks and supports possible, making it impossible for the enemy team to use any other strategy, as if they switched they wouldn't have the durability to whittle down the enemy team, while still lacking the offensive capabilities to break through their defense any faster. Also, I think I should talk again about a point I wanted to make in my last video, but didn't make clear enough. And that being that tanks were the reason why goats came to existence. I think I made it seem like I put all of the blame on the tanks without putting anything on the supports, while that isn't really the case. For me personally, the main reason how this came to existence is the combination of the two and how both of the two work together for it. The reason why I mainly criticize the tanks for it is because I think the high healing outputs of the supports is something very important to the core of the game, while the defensive utility that most of the tanks provides isn't that necessary, especially when you consider the amount of defensive utility that some of them have. But there are scenarios where you would want to drop the healing on support class characters. For example, when using them for enemies in PvE games. But in these scenarios, all of the classes vary more from the traditional split than you would expect. That's mainly because you want every unit to feel a threat to you, making it that every unit would have a certain amount of damage or utility to actually make it threatening. One example of how you could split the roles would be how the roles are split under the bugs in DRG. Here, for example, most units have some amount of damage to be threatening. That causes most offensive units to have some sort of utility or be threatening in the way they deal damage. For example, the slasher has a slow when hitting you, and someone like the acid splitter leaves an area of effect behind which will deal damage to you when standing in it. Meanwhile, tanks don't really have any utility and function mainly as bullet sponges, causing them to be very close to their stereotypical categorization. But supports are by far the most interesting what they have done with them, especially since it's very hard to find characters which exclusively fit the support role, with most of them being enemies like the web spitter or the stingtail, which could just as well be classified as DPSs. The only real exclusive supportive enemy is the Warden, who gives every enemy nearby damage reduction, making it that he is one of the highest priorities in targeting your enemies. Well, now only one question remains. How should the class identities be designed? Well, that's nearly impossible to answer. Since all games are so different from each other, you can't give a basic design principle out for every game. But there are many basic rules you can set that will apply to nearly everything. To give an example of what I'm talking about, let's start with an obvious one. Don't give your enemies in PvE games too much healing. This is something very obvious, as it is very frustrating to have all your enemies heal up again after you damage them, especially in PvE games where enemies can be way bulkier. That's why it's very important to limit the amount of healing and ways of healing they have. And especially important is that counterplay to it is very obvious. It doesn't always need to be easy, the player just needs to be aware that it is there. The second rule is that you should never overload your class roles, meaning that you shouldn't give them too many different roles they have to or can fill. This can still work out fine if you split the roles among multiple characters in the class and don't force them on a single character, which usually creates a jack of all trades, meaning that the character is either very OP as it is great at everything or extremely underpowered as even though it can do anything, it isn't great at anything. And if this philosophy is applied across the whole class, it gets even worse as the entire class suddenly becomes the most important class as it can do everything and could potentially even replace another class as it fills the same roles. The last and final rule I would set is that classes shouldn't fill the same roles. This is mainly in PvP games, as in PvE games the playstyle you have can be way more specific without ruining the game. While in PvP games, when the entire game gets too defensive, it suddenly creates metas where every fight takes an eternity to finish. And of course roles can be filled by multiple classes. The important part is that it doesn't get out of hand, which could for example happen by both the healer and the tank focusing on defensive utility mainly. And this doesn't just apply to defensive utility, this also applies to other things, like for example damage. If this gets too high, fights will be over so quick that you rarely have time to react, making it that the first one who shoots will usually win the fight, which will make the gameplay frustrating for obvious reasons. These are the 3 rules that I would say need to be followed when designing classes in video games. But what do you think? Leave a comment with your opinion in the comments and see you in the next video.